You believe you're awake right now. But what if I told you that most people who consider themselves awakened are merely dreaming a different dream, a more elaborate dream, more convincing yet still a dream? The real question isn't whether society is asleep, but whether you, who believe you've opened your eyes, aren't simply experiencing a more sophisticated illusion of consciousness. We live in an era where information circulates at unprecedented speed. Never before have so many people had access to philosophy, psychology, spirituality, and knowledge that was once reserved for the few. And yet, something strange happens. The more information we consume, the more convinced we become of our own lucidity. We read about mass manipulation and think we're immune. We study cognitive biases and assume others are the victims of them. We discover how media shapes perceptions and believe our discernment protects us. But this very certainty may be the most elaborate of veils. The ancient Greek philosophers already warned about this. Socrates, with his famous declaration that he only knew that he knew nothing, wasn't being modest. He was pointing to something fundamental about the nature of true knowledge. Genuine consciousness begins the moment we recognize the vastness of our own ignorance. But at some point along this journey, many of us traded the search for certainty. We accumulated concepts, theories, and explanations until we built an intellectual fortress that makes us feel safe, even superior. And that fortress, paradoxically, can become our most sophisticated prison. The philosopher Gurdjieff described humanity as sleeping machines, reacting automatically to external stimuli without ever questioning the nature of their reactions. He proposed that most people live in a state of collective hypnosis, executing learned patterns while firmly believing they're making free choices. But here's the trap few mention. Those who discover these ideas frequently leap to the conclusion that they're now awake. And this leap, this rush to declare oneself conscious, is precisely what keeps them prisoners of a new kind of sleep. Think for a moment about how you got here. Perhaps you began by questioning something in your life. Perhaps you felt a diffuse discomfort, a sense that something didn't make sense in the world around you. You sought answers. You found books, videos, ideas that seemed to explain that unease. And gradually, a new narrative formed. A narrative in which you stopped being part of the sleeping masses to become someone who sees beyond appearances. But narratives are always dangerous when we confuse them with reality itself. The psychologist Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called individuation, the process by which a person becomes genuinely themselves, and he repeatedly warned about a phenomenon he observed in his patients: ego inflation. It happens when someone comes into contact with contents of the collective unconscious, with powerful symbols and archetypes, and instead of integrating this material humbly, begins to identify with it. The person no longer seeks wisdom. They believe they are wisdom incarnate. Have you noticed this in communities dedicated to personal or spiritual development? There's frequently an atmosphere of veiled superiority, condescending glances toward those who haven't awakened yet, a special vocabulary that separates the initiated from the profane. And this separation, this need to distinguish oneself from the sleeping, reveals exactly the opposite of what it intends to demonstrate. It reveals an ego still hungry for validation, only now using spirituality or philosophy as its new territory of conquest. If this idea has already resonated with you, imagine what comes next. Subscribe so you don't miss this journey. There's a crucial difference between knowing about something and living something. I can read all the books about swimming, watch hundreds of videos, memorize every technique and movement, but until I get in the water, I won't know how to swim. The same happens with consciousness. We can accumulate information about meditation, about Stoic philosophy, about depth psychology, about contemplative traditions from East and West. We can build an impressive intellectual edifice. But knowledge is not transformation. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh used to say that washing dishes to wash dishes is different from washing dishes to get it over with. The difference lies in the quality of presence. And this quality cannot be acquired through concepts. It needs to be cultivated moment by moment in the direct and naked experience of life happening now. But our culture values accumulation so much that we transfer this habit to the spiritual and philosophical domain. We collect retreat experiences, meditation techniques, quotes from masters, and each new acquisition reinforces our sense of progress. We're evolving, we think. We're becoming more conscious. But being conscious is not a position one reaches and maintains. It's a continuous movement, an openness that needs to be renewed at every instant. Allow me to share something you might recognize in your own journey. There's a moment, after discovering certain truths about how the world works, when we begin to look at the people around us with a mixture of pity and frustration. We see our family members repeating patterns, our friends being manipulated by advertisements, strangers on the street absorbed in their phones like modern zombies. And we feel a peculiar loneliness, the loneliness of someone who believes they see what others don't see. But this loneliness carries within it a subtle lie. It assumes we're outside the system we criticize. It assumes our vision is clear while others is cloudy. It assumes there's a safe place from which we can observe the matrix without being part of it. And this assumption is precisely what the most sophisticated matrix wants us to believe. Nietzsche, in his work on the transvaluation of all values, warned about the danger of simply inverting hierarchies. If before we considered X superior to Y, and now we consider Y superior to X, we haven't escaped the game. We've just switched sides. True liberation requires questioning the very structure that creates superiors and inferiors, awakened and asleep, conscious and unconscious. When we identify as awakened, we automatically create the category of the asleep. And this division, this need for contrast, reveals that we're still operating within a binary system that limits our understanding. But there's a different path. And it doesn't begin with more knowledge, but with a kind of deliberate unknowing. Mystics from various traditions speak of the cloud of unknowing, of the dark night of the soul, of the emptying that precedes any genuine filling. Before finding who we truly are, we need to lose who we believe ourselves to be, including the identity of the conscious person, the spiritual seeker, someone who understands. This doesn't mean abandoning discernment or pretending all perspectives are equally valid. It means recognizing that true consciousness is not a trophy to be displayed, but a process to be lived. It's not an arrival, but a journey without end. It's not a certainty that separates us, but a humility that connects us. In practice, this can manifest in simple ways. When you feel that impulse to correct someone who doesn't understand, pause, not to repress the impulse, but to observe it. Where does this need come from? What does it protect? What would happen if you simply listened without the secret agenda of elevating your own position? When you catch yourself judging someone as asleep, unconscious, or programmed, observe that too. Is this judgment creating connection or separation? Is it opening your heart or closing it? Is it expanding your understanding or merely confirming what you already believe you know? True consciousness doesn't need to announce itself. It manifests in the quality of presence, in the capacity to listen deeply, in the willingness to have your certainties questioned without feeling threatened. It appears in the compassion that arises naturally when we stop seeing others as inferior and begin to recognize in them the same universal human struggle. But there's an even deeper secret that few know. The illusion of consciousness we've discussed isn't just an individual error. It's fed by social structures that profit from our sense of superiority. Think about the industries that have formed around personal development. Each course promises the next level. Each book offers the definitive key. Each guru presents the true path. And we, consumers eager to awaken, move from one promise to another, accumulating certificates of consciousness without ever questioning whether this very search hasn't become a sophisticated form of distraction. The system doesn't fear questioners, it fears present people. Questioners are still reacting to the system, defining themselves in opposition to it. Genuinely present people simply live differently, without needing the validation of being seen as different. And here we arrive at the most uncomfortable revelation of all. Perhaps there's no final state of full consciousness to be achieved. Perhaps the very search for this state is the ego's last trick, its most refined form of perpetuating itself. Perhaps awakening isn't about arriving somewhere, but about being fully where we already are. Not about seeing more than others, but about seeing with more love. Not about escaping the sleeping society, but about finding shared humanity even in those who seem furthest from any consciousness. Zen masters speak of beginner's mind, one that sees infinite possibilities where the expert sees only limitations. After years of practice, the genuine practitioner doesn't become wiser in the conventional sense. They become more empty, more available, more capable of meeting each moment as if it were the first. They don't know more, they're more present to what is. So, what to do with all of this? Perhaps the invitation isn't for you to become more conscious, but to let go of the need to be conscious. Not to accumulate more knowledge, but to allow the knowledge you already have to dissolve into lived wisdom. Not to separate yourself from the sleeping society, but to recognize that all of us, without exception, are navigating different degrees of illusion, and that this shared condition is exactly what makes us human. The true revolution doesn't happen when more people wake up. It happens when those who believe they've awakened find the courage to question the nature of their own awakening. When the question is no longer who's awake and who's asleep, but rather, what does it mean to be truly alive in this moment, in this breath, in this unique and unrepeatable encounter we call existence? You don't need more information. You don't need more techniques. You don't need to prove to anyone, least of all yourself, that you're conscious. What you need, perhaps, is simply the courage to stop searching, to stop accumulating, to stop comparing yourself. And in that space of pause, discover what has always been here, patiently waiting for your attention. If this video touched something in you, leave your like and share it with someone you feel needs to hear this message. Not because that person is more asleep than you, but because we all deserve gentle reminders that the journey continues, always continues. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so we can continue this exploration together. See you in the next video.